Hi there, welcome to my video series about making a bike frame in my garage. I am not a professional frame builder, I'm just doing this as a hobby, but this isn't my first frame either. This will be frame number 8 for me, so I'm not a complete beginner. But I'm also no Paul Brody. Shout out to Paul and Mitch for making great YouTube videos. I've watched all their frame building videos multiple times. Go check out Paul Brody's YouTube channel if you haven't already. This channel will be on the other end of the frame building spectrum from Paul. I'm just a guy messing around in his garage. No fancy machinery and a lot of making do with minimal investment on simple tools. I never took a frame building class. I'm completely self-taught, mostly through hours of reading online forums. I did take an intro oxyacetylene welding course at a local art center to learn how to use the torch safely and not blow myself up. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the bikes I've built so far, a quick look at my tool benches, a little bit about how I design and build my frames, and then I'll set up my frame jig. If you're interested in following along in this project, be sure to hit like and subscribe. As I said, I've built 7 frames so far, all steel, all fillet brazed, all meant to be ridden on dirt. Nothing fancy, but I'm happy with how they've all turned out. They've all ridden great with no issues. My first frame was a fat bike. I rode that frame for 9 years in some pretty crappy conditions. Snow, road salt, flooded trails, rocky beaches, sand, mud. It was put away dirty after nearly every ride, and now it sits on the wall in my garage. The only reason I retired the frame is because I built myself a new fat frame with different geometry. My most recent build was a 26 plus ATB. I like watching all these retro builds and retro mods of 80s and 90s bikes on YouTube, but I'm sorry, I just cannot go back to rim brakes. This build was a modern take on the kind of bike I dreamt of riding as a teenager in the late 80s, and I really like how it turned out. I built my son a frame a couple years ago, but all the other frames I've built so far have been for my own personal use. Throughout this video series, you'll see that I'm using some pretty simple tools, mostly hand tools and basic machines bought online or at local hardware stores. The few specialized bike frame building tools I've purchased have been relatively inexpensive. Here's my cheap tubing bender from Amazon, and my cheap hardware store drill press. This is a cheap welding table from Northern Tool. I have a small arbor press, a little mini belt sander and disc sander, and lastly, this is my jerry-rigged miter finisher. So I rough cut my miters with a hacksaw or a Dremel, then I get it close with hand files, then the miter finisher lets me get really accurate and tight miters. So now let's talk about designing the bike. One of the most useful frame building specific tools I bought was BikeCAD Pro. I built the first few frames with the free version of BikeCAD, but I also had to make a full-size drawing to get all the info I needed. If I remember correctly, with the free version, you don't get the angles between the tubes, so I had to make a full-size drawing so I could physically measure the angles. I need the angles between the tubes in order to cut the miters at the correct angle. BikeCAD Pro is the biggest single tool purchase I made for this hobby, but I feel it's worth it. And now I just use BikeCAD Pro and skip the full-size drawing. It saves me a lot of time. I did play around with RattleCAD, which is another frame building CAD program out there, and I liked it, but never used it for an actual build. It might be a good option if you aren't willing to invest in BikeCAD. So here's the plan. This will be a fillet brazed steel hardtail mountain bike frame, 27.5 inch wheels with up to 3.0 tires, 150 millimeter fork, 142 millimeter through axle rear spacing, and it'll fit a 170 millimeter dropper. You might be curious about some of those specs, but I'm building this around parts that I already own. I should probably mention at this point that I'm 6.5 feet tall, or 198 centimeters. That's without shoes on. So if some of the numbers look a little on the long side, that's why. There's a lot going on here, but trust me, all those dimensions are useful in the design process. This particular design shows the bike with no sag in the suspension. I also like to create a design when the bike is fully sagged. This will give me a better idea of how the bike will actually handle when I'm riding it. Here's the geometry chart for the bike, both without sag and with 30% sag. Lastly, I make a version with just the frame that includes all the dimensions I need to set up the jig and miter the tubes, like all the stuff I need when I'm actually building the frame. Setting up the jig is the first step in my build process. The first of many, many steps. This is a note that I have in my phone. I know it looks like a lot of steps, and don't worry, the series isn't going to be 89 episodes long. These are all the little steps that go into making a frame. Building a bike frame is a ton of work, but if you break it down into a bunch of baby steps, it becomes manageable. And once you get a few steps into it, you start to build momentum. I've tweaked and adjusted these steps with each frame I've made. There's always room for improvement, but I'm feeling pretty good about my process at this point. So like I said, step number 1, set up the jig. This is my homemade 80/20 beam style frame jig. It's a simple jig that requires less machined parts than other designs I've seen. For me, simpler is better. It has more flex than I'd like, but it does the job. The current jig does include a few machined parts that I purchased over the years, like the rear dummy axle holder, but early versions of my jig used only 80/20 parts and tapered washers that I purchased from Paragon Machine Works. You can see one of the washers here on the bottom bracket holder. Shout out to Paragon Machine Works, great company, making great stuff. I did eventually buy machined pucks and cones, which help hold everything a bit more solidly. One of the many nice things about BikeCAD Pro is that it spits out the 4 dimensions I need for my jig, which makes setup pretty easy. So here I am setting the bottom bracket shell at 745 millimeters, which is the number I got from BikeCAD. The center of the shell is offset by 12.7 millimeters from the edge of the holder. So I actually set the stop at roughly 757.7 and then slide the holder down against it. It's a little fiddly, and having the camera and the light in the way didn't make it any easier. But for a homemade jig, I think setup is pretty quick and easy. The center of the bottom bracket shell is at 745 millimeters, and then 375 millimeters past that is where the rear axle goes. So that gives me 1120. So here I'm setting the rear axle at 1120. You'll notice that if it was much longer, I'd probably need a longer jig, but this will work. Next up is the head tube height. The bottom of the head tube should be at 241 millimeters, but you notice the bottom of the head tube puck there is 19 millimeters. So 241 minus 19 gives me 222. So here I am setting the head tube holder at 222. Next up is setting the rear axle height. It's kind of hard to see, but there's that Sharpie on the part there. There is a scribed line that I'm lining up, and this should be set at 220.4. It gets a little stuck here, so I have a little bit of trouble. Again, having the light and the camera in close for the shot here makes this a little more fiddly than it should be. Before I put any tubes into the jig, I'll double check all these numbers to make sure they're spot on. And the last thing I need to do is center the bottom bracket shell. The last frame I built had a standard 1.5 inch bottom bracket, and this new one's going to have a T47. And since the different bottom bracket shells fit on the puck at different locations, I need to adjust the center. I've only used 73 millimeter or 73.5 millimeter bottom bracket shells on this particular setup. You know, if I make another fat bike and put a 100 millimeter bottom bracket, I'd have to make a new center mark on that. And there it is. Jig is all set up. Now I'm ready to start mitering some tubes and fitting them into the jig. In the next video, I'll go over the tubes I chose for this project. I'll mark the butts, I'll cut the seat tube to length, and miter the seat tube to the bottom bracket shell. Because I'm using less than ideal tools, it's a hobby, and I work full time, I'm planning on about 2 videos a month at this point. If you're interested in following along as I build myself a new bike frame, please hit those like and subscribe buttons so you'll see the new videos when they come out. As the project builds momentum and it gets warmer in my garage, I'll try and post more frequently. If you know someone that might like this video, be sure and share it. Thanks for watching. Take care. See you next time.